Cardinal News is telling the little-known stories of Virginia's role in our country's march to independence. As we head toward America's 250th anniversary, we'll examine the events, people, and places that shaped the Commonwealth and the nation. Together we can better understand the role of our ancestors beyond what's in the history books. This is Cardinal 250, made possible in part by funding from the Virginia American Revolution 250 Commission.
Hello and welcome to Cardinal News 250. I'm Lisa Rowan, filling in for Dutchy Jesse. We want to thank you for listening. Cardinal News 250 is sponsored by Bank of Botetourt, focused on you. And this project is made possible in part by funding from the Virginia American Revolution 250 Commission. We're joined today by Eric Monday, a noted local historian who specializes in the Revolutionary War history of Western Virginia and a member of the Virginia American Revolution 250 Commission. Eric, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, and thank you to Cardinal News for their fantastic job they've done in covering the 250th.
Awesome. Well, Western Virginia has no battles in the American Revolution, but still played a key role in this fight for independence. We're going to talk about the role of this part of the state in two parts, first before the war and then during it. So let's start with the Proclamation of 1763. Tell us what that was, Eric, and why it was so controversial at the time.
So you have to go back a little bit before 1763 to get to that proclamation, and it's really about the French and Indian War, and it's about settlement out here on the frontier. And Western Virginia, and I think they still teach Virginia history in fourth grade, you don't really hear the Western Virginia story. What you get in Virginia history is Jamestown, and then in 1619, the slaves came to Jamestown, and it was all big tobacco plantations, and they were all the second sons of Virginia aristocracy, and they all lived in big mansions and drank tea and wore wigs and silk stockings, and that was not what it was like out here on the frontier. These folks didn't really come through Jamestown or even Tidewater, Virginia. They tended to come in through the ports in Baltimore and Philadelphia. And these were Scotch-Irish. They weren't even English. They were Scotch-Irish people. Tended to be Presbyterian or Baptists or other dissenters, and not really fond of the English kings anyway, because Scots and Irish weren't fond of English kings. Or they were what we called the Pennsylvania Dutch, but that's really Deutsch. They were Germans from the Rhine Valley, and these were people whose parents or grandparents had experiences with the 30 Years' War. If the ruler of your little local town was Catholic, you were expected to be Catholic. If Protestant, you were expected to be Protestant. And then if somebody didn't like you, they'd run in and burn your village. So these people came over to America kind of starting in 1700 through the 1720s. And they came south through the Shenandoah Valley, and these were people who, one, didn't like to be told what to do. They wanted to settle where they wanted to settle, worship how they wanted to worship, and they were really into getting land, which brought them in conflict with the people who were here before, the Native Americans. And further to the west, the French. So by 1756, that had kind of reached a boiling point, and it sparked off the French and Indian War, which in Europe is called the 7 Years' War. And that was actually started by George Washington. He led a little expedition out near Pittsburgh, got into a fight with some French soldiers out there. Both the English and the French claimed the area around Pittsburgh. And so George Washington really is the one that kicked off, he started the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, which the English ultimately won at ruinous cost. And in 1763, at the end of that war, King George III made a proclamation because he said, they'd driven the French out of North America. And the king had acquired all of these new Native American indigenous subjects who were to the west of the frontier, and he considered them to be every bit as much his subjects as he did the white settlers who had come down the Shenandoah Valley. And so the king thought that he could arbitrarily resolve the issue of frontiersmen coming up against Native Americans. And he said, if you're west of this line, you're not going to have the protection of my troops, and you really shouldn't be settling over there at all. I mean, and this was really the crest of the Blue Ridge. I mean, if you go to Blacksburg, that line runs right down the middle of Main Street in Blacksburg. So all of the Virginia Tech campus is actually directly going against the orders of the king because they're on the wrong side of the street. As you might imagine, that went over like a lead balloon out here on the frontier. These were people who were already used to, frankly, stealing land from Native Americans and fighting them, didn't care what the king had to say. There was already plenty of settlement to the west of that line, and the line really existed more in the breach than in the obeying of it. People didn't care. It was just something that ticked them off. Who are you in London to tell us where we can and cannot live? And, we've been fighting these savages, as far as the frontiersmen were concerned, for years. And the only way that you can deal with them is force. That was the frontier attitude towards the indigenous population here. And then couple with that, you out here on the frontier, you've got all the frontiersmen really ticked off because the king's saying you can't go west of that line. And for the rest of the colonies, the British said, we won the French and Indian War. It was ruinously expensive. And we think you folks in the colonies ought to help pay for some of that. And by the way, you should also help pay for your own defense. And the colonial response was, well, yeah, we may perhaps should pay our fair share. But if we're going to be part of that inherent part of the British Empire, we'd like a voice in Parliament. And that's where you get the whole taxation without representation thing, to go back to our elementary school history lesson. That was where that came from. It was to pay for the French and Indian War. And the colonists were told, well, you're not going to get a voice in London. And that was what really led to the revolution.
Wow. It's wild to think about that one phrase that we all know and what it really goes back to and its ties to this part of the state. And you made that great comment about Blacksburg and where the proclamation line was. If you're out there listening and you're wondering where where you're sitting now might have been related to this line, it runs down sort of the western edge of what is now Highland, Bath, and Allegheny counties, sort of zigzags through Craig and Giles counties, runs through Montgomery, as we said, Floyd, Franklin, Patrick, and Carroll counties before going down into North Carolina. So there's a lot of our coverage area here at Cardinal that sort of touches this proclamation line that is such a big part of what led to the Revolutionary War. Next, we're going to pivot a little bit to what's called Lord Dunmore's War and how that contributed to the eventual revolution. We're coming up closer to that point in time now with the revolution. Tell us about that.
So, Lord Dunmore's War is, if you're a Southern historian, Southern historians tend to call it and the big battle is called the Battle of Point Pleasant. We'll talk about that in a second, and that's really referred to as the first battle of the Revolution. So we did have one battle out here on the western frontier. It just happened before the Revolution. And that's a direct result of this stuff we were just talking about, the friction between the frontier settlers and the Native American population, and the just flat out ignoring the proclamation line of 1763. And just a general feature of life out here on the frontier. You have these very independent-minded, don't tell me what to do, and I want more land frontiersmen who are, and it's just this voracious desire for more land. And that absolutely brings them up into conflict with the Native Americans, who are losing their ancestral tribal lands, their hunting grounds, their trading routes, their village sites, all of that. And that led to really extreme violence and really brutal stuff on both sides. I mean, I'm certainly not going to sugarcoat it. The Native American population, we're not talking about folks who sat in their villages and were basket weavers. I mean, it was a warrior culture as well. So you had, kind of angry Highland Scots coming up against Native American tribal warriors, and really horrible things happened out here on the frontier. And it didn't just happen between the fighting men, women, and children. No one was spared on both sides. Really, truly brutal fighting, and often hand-to-hand combat. This was not, you see those battle scenes from The Patriot of these lines of soldiers firing each other. It wasn't like that. It was really nasty, mean conflict. And that really reached a head by 1774, primarily with the Shawnee and the Mingo out here in what is now really more West Virginia is where it unfolded. Of course, at that time, West Virginia was part of Virginia. And we had a new governor, Lord Dunmore, who was himself a Scotsman. And he kind of had something to prove because his father had been a Jacobite. His father had been a rebel against George III's father, George II. And so Charles Murray, Lord Dunmore, had something to prove. He was immensely very popular when he arrived here in Virginia. His predecessor, Lord Botetourt, that's a name that probably comes to mind if you hear. He was really popular. And Dunmore started out that way as well. We named a county after him, too. Got rid of it after the Revolution. It's now Shenandoah County, further up with Woodstock as its county seat. And we named another county for his son, Lord Fincastle. And that county does not exist anymore. It's sort of centered on what is now Wythe County. But the little town of Fincastle in Botetourt does survive, and that's where that name comes from. It is named after the aristocratic title of the last governor of Virginia's son. So Dunmore arrives here, and there's all this fighting going on out on the frontier. And he says, "Well, we're going to put an end to this once and for all. We're going to crush these savages, and as an added bonus, we're also going to lay claim to all of that really rich land in the Ohio Valley, which had originally been promised to Virginia by Charles II when he became King of England after Oliver Cromwell died and the English Commonwealth came to an end. You might remember they chopped off Charles I's head. Charles II was his son. And that's how Virginia has come to be known as the Old Dominion, because we remained loyal. How ironic is that? Virginia remained loyal to the king, Charles I. And so when Charles II regained his throne, he called Virginia my oldest dominion. And so that's where Virginia's nickname comes from. So anyway, I've gotten really off track here. Dunmore calls out the state militia, which are all local folks, right? And particularly out here on the frontier. So there were two big columns, one of which was formed over here in Salem under a man named Andrew Lewis, who later went on to great fame as a general in the Revolution. In fact, he later helped push Dunmore out of Virginia when the Revolution got started. But so there were two columns of men who marched out of Western Virginia into what is now West Virginia. And they met the leader of the Native Americans, Chief Cornstalk, at Point Pleasant, which is way up in the panhandle of West Virginia. It's right on the Ohio River. And they utterly defeated the Indians. And they did it unlike the French and Indian War, because there were plenty of frontiersmen fighting in the French and Indian War, but they were under the command of British officers. That was not the case here. These were men who did it as a DIY project. They were state militia under local state native Virginia officers, and they won an overwhelming victory. And Dunmore's really popular at this point, but these guys are also really full of themselves because as far as they're concerned, hey, we went out there, we really, kicked some butt, for lack of a better term, and we did it all by ourselves. And we're, forgive my language, we're kind of badasses. So
We're feeling confident.
Yeah, so that's the fall of 1774. And if you'll go back to your long ago elementary school history, what else is going on in 1774? Well, you've had the Boston Massacre, you've had the Boston Tea Party, you've had the British blockading the port of Boston. These were these very difficult Yankees up in New England that were just kind of driving that bus. But you had a lot of really rebellious stuff going on to the north, and the British were really kind of tightening the screws down on the colonists and suspending local legislators and quartering troops in British homes and all that stuff we hear about in terms of the tyranny of the British, right? And so after Lord Dunmore's war, it's actually the colonists out here on the frontier. You have a lot of colonists all up and down the eastern seaboard saying, we don't like being pushed around by the British. We are ourselves free British men and women, and we want our own liberties and our own rights. And there were lots of declarations about we need to stand upon our rights and our liberties. But it was out here on the frontier in a little wide spot in the road called Austinville, which was at the time, it wasn't called Austinville at the time, it was called the Lead Mines. I'll give you one guess why they named it Lead Mines. And it's now called Austinville because it was the birthplace of Stephen Austin, who, later rose to fame out in Texas. But so a bunch of frontier leaders, most of whom were veterans of Point Pleasant, met out there at the Lead Mines. And for the very first time, they said, we're actually willing to fight and die about this. They put it in words. We are willing to live and die in liberty, which was the first time that any British subject here in North America had said that. And even though it was out here on the frontier, that was in January of 1775, by the way. And two of those men were married to sisters of a guy named Patrick Henry, who I think most of us have heard about. And another one had the foresight to hire a bunch of dispatch writers to send copies of that resolution all over Virginia, and particularly straight to Williamsburg, where it was printed in the Virginia Gazette within a week, and within 3 weeks known all over the eastern seaboard. And you have a lot more resolutions after that that start to talk about a willingness to fight. But it was out here on the Virginia frontier was the very first time that was actually put pen to paper. That doesn't mean that there weren't people elsewhere who were thinking it. It was just, this was the first time that people were actually willing to write it down, put their names to it, and really put themselves out there. So that's January of 75. And, by March of 75, you've got Patrick Henry giving that famous speech, "Give me liberty or give me death." And then 2 weeks after that, you have Lexington and Concord, and the revolution gets underway. All because, I'll just go ahead and claim the credit for us out here in Western Virginia, all because a bunch of frontiersmen won a battle at Point Pleasant in Lord Dunmore's war, got pretty full of themselves, and were like, you know what? Yeah, we are willing to fight. We'll take you on and we'll beat you.
It's amazing what a little confidence can do. It can start a whole war. Now, let's turn to the war going on itself, and we're going to skip ahead a little bit to around 1780. There's a group of militiamen called the Over Mountain Men. Again, we're talking about these local troops that are sort of, I would say scraped together from who was available and who wanted to be involved. Tell us about the Over Mountain Men and what their role was.
Okay, a little bit of background there, because you really hit the fast forward button, right?
We went
we
so fast forward.
17,
We're just like accelerating through the entire conflict.
yeah, 1775, and the war gets underway. So by the summer of 75, Lord Dunmore, who had been super popular the fall before, is the most hated man in all of Virginia, and is uh, accidentally shot in the leg in Williamsburg, and he flees Williamsburg, never to return. So
There
royal
were finger
control,
quotes on that if you couldn't see it, if you're not
yeah.
watching. There were finger quotes around accidental.
Oh my lord, did I shoot the governor? So so yeah, he leaves, and so royal control is collapsed in Virginia by the summer of 1775, and then there are some battles down in Tidewater, and then by the spring of 1776, in May of 76, Virginia goes ahead and declares independence. And they also pass a resolution to send up to the Continental Congress up in Philadelphia saying, hey, we're independent. We think all the rest of us should be too. And we also think that we should form a union, the United Provinces of North America, which is a term that you see written into the Declaration of Independence, which is adopted, obviously, in Philadelphia in the summer of 76. So that gets us to independence. And then after that, got to say, a whole lot didn't happen in Virginia, really, until 1780. And really that started, there were a couple of, actually further out on the frontier, George Rogers Clark went off and conquered all of the old Northwest, everything from Ohio up to Minnesota. And maybe we'll do a podcast on that some other time.
Yes, about how we were greedy.
That's a pretty interesting story. But by 1779, the fighting out here in the East had kind of stagnated, and it was all happening up north. You had Germantown, Princeton, Valley Forge, Monmouth, all of those campaigns, but the war had just kind of settled down into a stalemate in New England and New York. And the British decided, well, let's go south. So they came up with what was called the King's Southern Strategy, which was to take Savannah and Charleston and move inland. The thinking being there are more loyalists, people who are Tories, people who are loyal to the crown in the South, which was true. And if we go to the South and we have these successes, they will flock to the king's colors and we'll be able to win this war. And it started off really well. The British had tried to capture Charleston back in 1778 and failed. They came back down here under the command of a guy that we remember from elementary school, Lord Cornwallis. Mm-hmm. And they did successfully take Savannah and Charleston. And then they started marching inland, and they utterly crushed the American army at a battle called Camden, which was our general was Horatio Gates, who he had actually won the Battle of Saratoga up in New York, and was very famous for a while. He even conspired to try to replace George Washington as commander-in-chief, but his career came to an end on the battlefield at Camden. It was said that Horatio Gates got on his horse and fled the battlefield like a rank coward, and rode all the way from South Carolina to present-day Charlotte. So George Washington, who, as you might imagine, wasn't real fond of Horatio Gates for trying to replace him, immediately replaced Horatio Gates with a general named Nathaniel Greene. And Greene never won a battle, but he won the campaign. He ran Cornwallis ragged all over the Carolinas, and it eventually led to Yorktown. And I think we'll talk a little bit about this towards the end of the podcast. But as part of Cornwallis's campaign, he had sent a Scotsman, Major Patrick Ferguson, out into the real frontier out here in the West, mostly in the Carolinas, to rally all those Tories. And there were a lot of Tories out here, and interestingly, a lot of them were Scotsmen who, theoretically don't like a the German Hanoverian King of England, but many of them were loyal to the crown. So Ferguson came out into the Carolina frontiers, and he did raise an enormous force of Tories that did flock to the king's banner. And he also, maybe shades of the Battle of Point Pleasant, he also got a little bit ahead of himself ego-wise and issued this proclamation to all on the frontier saying, you either return to the loyalty of the crown or I will lay waste to your farms and put your homes to fire and sword. That did not go over very well with the patriot people out here on the frontier. Again, kind of short. I myself am Scots-Irish, so a bunch of short-tempered Scotch-Irish rednecks. We don't take kindly to that sort of thing, and that's exactly what happened out here on the frontier. And it was mostly settlers further southwest. They met at the muster grounds out in Abingdon, and also Sycamore Shoals, which is now in East Tennessee. It's near Kingsport. Mm-hmm. And these were patriot settlers here. And they wound up under the command of a man named William Campbell, who was one of the signatories of the Fincastle Resolutions and a veteran of the Battle of Point Pleasant, and who himself was quite a big deal out here on the frontier. He was a big man, both physically and reputationally. And so he and several other frontier leaders marched those men over the mountain from Sycamore Shoals and Abingdon down into North Carolina. You can follow their route today. We see these signs for scenic highways all over the place. The very first heritage trail was the Over Mountain Man Trail, which was designated in 1976 by President Carter. And it traces the line of these men's march from East Tennessee and southwestern Virginia down through the mountains of North Carolina, down along the French Broad Valley River, the one that flooded so horribly with Hurricane Helene. Mm-hmm. And they came through the mountains, and they found Ferguson's men at a place called Kings Mountain, North Carolina, which is down just outside of Gastonia to the west of Charlotte. That was in October of 1780. Ferguson and his men were camped on top of Kings Mountain, which is actually a smaller mountain that sort of sits off away from the Blue Ridge chain. The Patriot frontiersmen surrounded Kings Mountain, crept up in the early dawn, and really that battle was over in less than half an hour. They killed hundreds of Ferguson's men, killed Ferguson himself. His body remains on the battlefield to this day. He was buried where he fell. And it is a tradition, if you visit the Kings Mountain National Military Site, that you throw a stone on top of Colonel Ferguson's grave to make sure he stays in it. And so there's this enormous pyramid of stones on top of his grave now. I've done that myself. But Tory sympathy all across the Carolinas and Virginia collapsed after Kings Mountain because it was such a lopsided victory. The Patriots lost hardly anyone. They killed hundreds of the Loyalists, marched the rest off into captivity, hanged several at Campbell's direction. And so the whole notion that the British had that the Tories would rise up in support of the king, it had been bubbling up, almost successful until Kings Mountain, and then it was just absolutely destroyed, crushed. Loyalist sympathy, they may have remained loyal to the king in their heads, but they certainly didn't talk about it after Kings. And the war in the South, which was going very badly for the Patriot Americans up to this point, with really low morale, turned on a dime. That was in October of 1780. In January of 81, I believe, the regular forces, also under Virginian Daniel Morgan, They defeated Bannister Tarleton, who was Cornwallis's cavalry commander. And if you've seen the movie The Patriot, which is really horrible history, although I guess it's got decent battle scenes in there, the real villain, Tavington, is modeled after Bannister Tarleton. Bannister Tarleton's kind of the villain of the American Revolution, and the Americans completely whipped his rear at the Battle of Cowpens. And so by the winter of 1781, the tide had really turned here in the South. American morale was back on the rise, and it gave Nathaniel Greene a real boost up in leading Cornwallis on his merry chase all around the Carolinas.
And that turn on a dime, it all changed starting at Abington for that march down to North Carolina.
Exactly.
Well, we are running out of time, but I want to squeeze in a little tiny bit. You had mentioned Yorktown and the road there. When we think of Western Virginia, we think a little bit about the Battle of Guilford House in North Carolina, but give us just a taste of why that is important in terms of Western Virginia's role in the Revolution.
Yeah, and I'll just tell you, Lisa, you chose poorly, because what I do in my real life job is I'm a lawyer, and talk. So I've talked way too long, and I apologize for that.
No, this has been great.
But so Guilford Courthouse is probably the most important little known battle in American history. As I said, Greene, he had Cornwallis chasing him all over the Carolinas. And Greene wrote in his diary, he said, we fight, we get beat, we fall down, we get back up, and we fight again. And what he did, without winning a single battle, and he didn't win Guilford Courthouse either, he just caused Cornwallis to chase him all over, mostly North Carolina, started out in South Carolina, and then all over North Carolina. And he would get beat and get beat and get beat. But but Greene, the Patriots, they could replace their men, because there were all these frontiersmen who kept volunteering. They would show up and maybe they'd fight in one battle, and then they'd go back home, take the crops, and then they'd come back the following month. So Greene's army was always getting bigger and getting smaller, getting bigger and getting smaller. But what happened at Guilford Courthouse, he led Cornwallis on this chase all the way up to the Dan River in what's now Halifax County, Virginia. Greene got all of his men to the north bank of the Dan River, and he stole all the boats. So Cornwallis is quite literally on the south bank cussing at him. So Greene spends a couple of weeks in Halifax and South Boston. A lot of frontiersmen from southwestern and southside Virginia come to Greene's aid. And then after a few weeks of rest and recuperation, he marches back into North Carolina, comes to a little place called Guilford Courthouse, which is now named Greensboro, North Carolina, after Nathaniel Greene. And basically what he's saying to Cornwallis is, bring it on, here I am, come on. So Cornwallis did come on. They met at Guilford Courthouse, fought a vicious, bloody battle. The Americans had three lines in that battle. The first line was North Carolina militia. They fired 2 shots and then ran away, as they were told to do. The British followed after them, and they hit the second line, which was Virginia militia, which really put it to them. And where I will say a direct ancestor of mine was sabred to death by one of Tarleton's cavalry dragoons. He died on the field at Guilford Courthouse. So this is a battle that means a great deal to me.
Yeah.
And then the Virginians then withdrew to the third line, which were Continental Army troops, regular Army troops with cannons. And the British hit that third line, and it just dissolved into this horrible hand-to-hand combat. And the British were starting to get the worst of it. And what Cornwallis did was, he said, fire our cannons into that group, his own men, along with the Americans, thinking that the discipline of the British Army would hold and the Americans would not. And that is what happened. The Americans broke, and Cornwallis won the battle. but he lost a quarter of his army at Guilford Courthouse. When the news reached London, it was said in Parliament that another such victory will destroy the British army. And after that, Cornwallis, and this is what we'll end on, after he took that beating from a bunch of frontiersmen from the Carolinas and Virginia, Cornwallis decided that it would be a really good idea if he, kind of like Greene, retreated for some rest, recuperation, and reinforcement at a very little obscure village called Yorktown. And that is a story that I think most of us do recall from American history.
Eric, this has been such a great way to take those little bits that we remember from our history books and the names that we recognize and to give it that depth and to bring it home to where so many of us are in Western Virginia. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Really appreciate it. And again, thank you, Cardinal News, for covering the revolution in such a spectacular way. The commission, the VA 250 Commission, is so proud of what y'all have done, and your coverage really, it is a fine example of what written journalism in Virginia used to be. I'll just go ahead and say that. Y'all have kept up that tradition of truly fine Virginia journalism. We're incredibly proud of y'all.
I love it. Well, thank you for that wonderful compliment. And thank you, Eric, for being here again today. And thank you for listening to Cardinal News 250. It's made possible in part by funding from the Virginia American Revolution 250 Commission. We also want to thank Bank of Botetourt, focused on you. And thanks to Sean Eddy of Eddy Alexander and Zach Shelton for Cardinal's technical support here for the podcast. You can read all of our Cardinal 250 stories and sign up for the Cardinal 250 newsletter at cardinalnews.org.
Thanks for listening to Cardinal 250, made possible in part by funding from the Virginia American Revolution 250 Commission. For more information on Cardinal News 250, including the Cardinal 250 and other newsletters, visit cardinalnews.org.